Good morning, everyone. How are we? We'll get back to Gideon in a minute. But, hi, I'm Karyn, if you haven't met me before, and I'm blessed to be bringing you God's Word today. But before we get back to Gideon, I've got a little exercise I want you to do. Not a physical exercise, no one needs that at this time of the morning. I'm talking about a little mental exercise. What I want you to do is to have a think about when you are half the age that you are now. Now, this might take some math. I'm 21. Half the age you were. I'm about 40, so I'm looking when I was about 20. If you're 60, look when you were 30. Have a think about that. Now, have a think about what you thought your life was going to be like. Got that in your head? Okay, now skip forward to today and have a look at what your life is like. Now, I want you to take 1 minute and turn to your neighbour and tell them how similar they are or how different they are. While you're doing that, I'll say hello to the people that are on the podcast so we don't have some empty silence. Hi to my mum. My mum's watching on the podcast. Hi, Mum. Okay, let's bring it back in. Let me see a show of hands. Put your hand up if your life now is exactly like you thought it would be. Okay, we have a couple. Tim, this is exactly where you thought you'd be. Oh, you don't think about anything. Okay. That makes it really easy. Okay, and we do have a couple. Now, what it is, put your hand up if it's kind of like it, maybe 50-50. Couple of people. Put your hand up if your life is nothing like you thought it would be. Look at that. That's a lot of people. Okay, here's my minute. Do you want to know when I was about 20, what I thought my life was going to look like? I'm actually serious. So maybe, my hair's almost like that. So when I was 20, that's what I wanted. I dropped out of uni because who wants to do a maths degree anyway? I didn't really have any career aspirations. I went to church, but I wasn't really involved. And I thought, just get married and have kids. That'll be my future. Now, can I just point out, if that is your life, if you are married with children and that's the main thing in your life at the moment, I'm not having a go, please believe me, because that's actually what I wanted. But that's not how things have turned out for me. If you had told 20-year-old Karyn that she was going to go and study IT and end up working in IT, she would have thought you were crazy. If you'd then told 20-year-old Karyn that not only would she study IT, but she'd do that for a while, then she'd go and study theology and she'd be looking for some new calling in her life in her early 40s, she would have thought you were a nutbag. So this is what my life actually looks like. So the cat on your left is Hercules. I don't know how clearly you can see it. He is staring into your soul. He is. And Glitch is just like, whatever, man. But that's what my life's turned out like. It's a little bit different from what I expected. And I found myself in my early 40s going, what's next, God? I'm a bit confused because I'm studying and I know you want me to do something, but I've got no idea where my life is going at the moment. Can anyone identify with that? No one. Sweet. You guys don't even need me to say anything then. This has been bringing up a lot of questions for me. And I want you to have a look at this list of questions and ask yourself, have you ever asked yourself one of these questions? How did my life end up like this? How did I end up a single 40-something with 2 cats? Is this God's plan for my life? What's my purpose? Did I actually miss God's calling somewhere? Am I too far gone? Maybe some of our people that are a little older and have retired, they think, well, I've retired now. Is my calling over? Am I done? Am I finished? What now? And maybe some of our younger people who are finishing school or are going into uni or finishing uni are like, what's my purpose, God? Where do you want me? So I'm going to attempt to answer some of these questions today. Perhaps not exactly how you think I might answer them, but an answer nonetheless. And when I look through those, there's 3 words that really jump out at me. Purpose, calling, and plan. Now, some of you will have heard of a guy called Rick Warren who wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. It's like an international multi-million bestseller. And he talks about 5 purposes for our life and this really cool explanation, but I need to bring it down to an easier level for me. To understand exactly what God's doing, I've brought it down to an even more simple level than that. So if you've read that book, it's great. It's a great book, highly recommend it, but I'm going even one step simpler than that. What I want to do is have a look at what purpose means, what calling means, and what plan means, and how that relates to my life in Jesus. So one thing I like to do, I like to look at dictionary definitions. I don't know whether anybody else does that. But to find out what something means, I go to dictionary.com, and this is what I found. So purpose is the reason for which something exists or is done, the reason something's made, the reason something is used. A calling, well, it's a call or a summons, some strong impulse or inclination, a profession, a vocation. I like this last one. It's the act of a person or a thing that calls. Plan is just a scheme or a method developed in advance. Okay, so they're nice dictionary definitions, but what does this actually mean for our lives? Purpose. What were we made for? The video clip before says we were made to be courageous. Absolutely true. That's actually from a movie. It's a great movie, Courageous, if you get a chance to see it. It's about really standing firm and living for God. But our purpose, to find out what our purpose is, we need to go back to when we were actually created and have a look at why God created us. So there's a verse in Genesis 1:26 that says, God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Now, what do you think that means? I mean, I know I look pretty good, but I don't think this is what God looks like. Don't know whether he looks like any of us. And I don't think it's actually talking about our external appearance at all. What it's talking about that we are made in God's image is that we have almost like a seed of God planted in our heart. We have this ability to know God, to understand God, to be in relationship with God. When Adam and Eve were created, they were created to be in a knowing relationship with God, to know him, to talk to him every day. But unfortunately, what happened, even though they were made in his image, to reflect him, to be like him, when they sinned, what they effectively did was chose a different path, a different kind of knowing. They chose to know the world, not to know God. And so part of the thing that Jesus came to restore was, yes, our salvation, but also to restore this relationship that we can have with God, this knowing relationship, this thing where we're in his likeness and we're actually reflecting him and relating to him. So we were made to be in relationship with Jesus. So a couple of other verses. He chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. And for God saved us to live a holy life. So if we're meant to be in a relationship with Jesus, the obvious outcome of that, if we keep growing more and more like Jesus and getting closer and closer to Jesus, is this word called holiness. And what holiness means is just more and more like Jesus, becoming more and more like Jesus. So I want to put it to you today that what we are actually created for is to be holy. What we were created for is to be in a relationship with Jesus, to grow more and more like him, and to be holy. Okay. What about our calling? So you've probably heard these verses before. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself, and then therefore go and make disciples of all people. So do these verses sound like God's asking us or telling us to do something? Yeah? To me, that's what a calling is. A calling is something God gets us to do, tells us to do. And these particular ones here, they're for everybody. We're all called to love our neighbour. We're all called to go and make disciples of all men. But I think there's also very specific things that God calls us, very specific tasks. I'm very glad that Patty has been called to lead Band of Brothers and not me, because I don't think I'd do a very good job of leading Band of Brothers. And just like Naomi does a great job of leading Sisterhood, people are called to do individual things. And if you look through the Bible, here's just a small list of names of people who are called for a very specific purpose. So, for example, Moses was called to go down to Egypt and get the people out of Egypt, tell Pharaoh to let the people go. You might not know the name Deborah. She was actually one of the earlier leaders of the Israelite people, and under her leadership there was many years of peace for the Israelite people. So callings can be two things, according to my definition. They can be things that God calls everyone to do, love your neighbour, to be salt and light to the earth. But they can also be specific things that God calls us to do in our daily life. So, purpose is to be holy, to be in relationship with Jesus, to be like Christ. Calling is the things that God calls us to do. What about the plan? Well, here's a great verse. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Notice that it says good works, not good work. It means that we don't just have a calling and that's it. Our life is a continual series of callings, and really the plan is just what God has prepared for us in advance. The thing I like about this, sometimes one of the earlier questions was, have I gotten too far off track? One of the beautiful things about God is he already knows everything we're going to do. He already knows when we're going to mess up. He already knows when we're going to make a bad choice. He already knows when we're going to get off the path. Nothing you do surprises God. It's not like you do something one day and he goes, oh my gosh, I never expected that. You can't surprise God. So he has already worked that stuff into the plan. He doesn't go, well, no, Karyn, this is the plan I had for you and you've gone off, so too bad. He's already worked it into the plan. So that's my three definitions. Our purpose in life is to be holy, to be like Christ. Our calling is the things that God calls us to do, and the plan is just the plan he's put together for it all. So it seems like a nice, simple definition. But the impact of doing it that way, of thinking of things that way, is actually quite profound. See, if we concentrate on our purpose in life being about being in relationship with Jesus and getting more and more like Jesus, what does that do? It actually takes our eyes off everything around us and it lifts our eyes to Jesus. And when we focus on Jesus, you know what happens? We find our identity in him. We find our meaning in him. We find our hope in him. Too often we can get caught up with what we're doing and what role we have and what ministry we have, and we find our identity in that. And what happens when the inevitable happens and our humanness pops up and we mess up? Well, if we're finding our identity in what we do, we're going to fall, we're going to crash when what we're doing doesn't work out. But if we've got our eyes focused on Jesus, focused on the Creator, focused on a relationship with him, we find our identity in him and our meaning in him. So if something goes wrong, it goes wrong, but our identity is still in him. Our identity, our meaning, our hope, everything is in him. And so that's why I say quite simply our purpose is a relationship with Jesus. That's it. That's what we need to focus on. And I guess the other advantage of this too is that if we end up doing some, really big calling, we don't get a big head about it because it's not us, it's not our calling, it's God's calling for us. And if we're keeping our eyes focused on him, finding our meaning in him, having our purpose in him, then we don't need to worry about what's happening around us. I think some people, even though I'm talking about plan and calling, some people need to hear that today. To focus on Jesus, fulfill our purpose in him. Don't worry about what's going on around you because God's got a plan and he's going to step you through it. So that's my definitions. It's nice and simple, isn't it? Is life nice and simple? No. But there's always some, that's nice, Karyn, but what about? But what about this? And I think it wouldn't be right if I didn't address some of the but what questions today. This is my favourite. It's not. Why won't you tell me the plan right now, God? Why won't you give me, I like project plans, why won't you give me a plan that tells me next Tuesday this is going to happen and then you're going to do this subject and then this is going to happen and you're going to meet this person who influences you in this way and you'll end up in this job? Yes. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, one of the girls that was here last night is very heavily pregnant, and I said to her, wouldn't it be nice to know when your baby's coming? Yes, it would. But we don't always know what's happening. And why do you think that is? Why do you think God doesn't go, here you go, Karyn, this is the whole plan for your life? I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think because sometimes we're not ready for it. Sometimes we need to grow more, we need to learn more, we need to make decisions on our own or in consultation with God, but we need to actually make decisions and grow through that. You know, Patty, if I said to you 5 years ago that you were going to run Band of Brothers, what would you have done? Ran away? Sometimes we're not ready to know what God has for us because either we'd run away screaming or we'd think, look at me, what I'm going to be doing. Sometimes we're just not ready. There's also a parable in Luke 16 where the gist of it basically is Jesus saying, you have to prove yourself trustworthy with small things before you get to do big things. And so it's all very nice to go, well, I want to be an international author, just to pick something random. But that doesn't just happen. And I think if you ask someone who you consider has a really big calling on their life, they're going to tell you it wasn't just a boom, there it is. I mean, I like to think of someone like Eva Burrows, who was the first female leader of the Salvation Army, and she was an Australian lady. She didn't just wake up one day and become general. She had all these callings, this series of callings, and she proved herself faithful over and over and over again and got the big calling. So sometimes I think we're not ready for it. Sometimes we need to prove ourselves in smaller things before we get the bigger things. Sometimes people do have an idea of where God's leading them. And sometimes people will have words spoken over them and by trusted people, like, I see God telling me that one day you're going to do this. Let me tell you, it doesn't always help. I know people who've been told one day you're going to be a Salvation Army officer, and they're like, how on earth does that work with where I currently am? Or one day you're going to do this. What? Sometimes knowing doesn't actually even help either. And the last thing about why I think sometimes God doesn't tell us the plan right now, and this is my particular one, sometimes waiting, trusting in God, relying on God, learning to live fully dependent on Him actually is the calling. And that's what God's been teaching me for me. I want to know what my next job is. I want to know what my next career is. I want to know where this study I'm doing is taking me. And God says, no, your calling right now is to do that and trust me and wait. Can I stop waiting now, God? No. Keep waiting. That's your calling. And I know that's hard. But tell you what, through the waiting, through the trusting, through being dependent on God, I am learning so much more about His love. So why doesn't God tell us the whole plan up front? Sometimes we're not ready for it. Sometimes we need to do smaller things before we get to the bigger things. But sometimes God's actually just telling us your calling right now is to be where you are and just learn to be more dependent on me. The next but question. How will God call me? Now, actually, I have a really easy answer for this one. Go and watch Donna's sermon from last week. Donna spoke last week on how to hear from God. And she spoke about how sometimes God speaks to us through the Bible, sometimes through other people, sometimes through the supernatural, through our circumstances, through prayer and all of the things like that. And it's an amazing message. So if you're wanting to hear from God and you want to know how to hear from God, go and listen to that message. And I really believe, did I miss my calling? Well, no, I don't actually think that if you're in a relationship with Jesus and you've got your eyes focused on Him, He's not going to let you miss the calling. You hear stories from people that, well, I kind of thought God was calling me to do something, but I ignored it, and then it got louder and louder and louder until God's like basically bashing me on the head going, Karyn, God won't let you miss the call if you are focused on Jesus and growing closer to Him. Okay, what if things are a mess? What if your life is a mess and you think, I've got this purpose to follow Jesus, but how's this all going to work out? How can this be God's plan? So many questions. Well, this is where Gideon comes in. Now, what was going on for the Israelite people at the time, briefly, is that they had been in slavery in Egypt Moses went down and did the whole let my people go thing, got them out of Egypt, and after much wandering in the desert, they ended up in the Promised Land. But the Israelite people over their whole history had this cycle, I guess, where they would follow God for a little while, go really well, things would be going great, and they'd just start to drift away. They'd start worshipping idols, they'd start ignoring God until some calamity happened. They'd turn back and go, God, help us. And of course, God would restore them and things would start again. And that cycle went on for a very long time. So before Gideon's time was actually when Deborah was the leader of the Israelite people. And there had been peace for about 40 years. And in that time, the Israelite people got complacent. Complacency is such a bad thing for us to do, to become complacent. And they became complacent. They stopped their regular worship of God, and slowly but surely they started worshipping the idols of the people around them. What had happened was the Israelite people had lost their purpose. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. It wasn't God's plan for them to be oppressed by the Midianites. It was just the consequence of what happened. And this verse here, verse 10, where God's saying, I'm the Lord your God, and I told you not to worship other people, but you did. It's pretty clear that what happened here is the Israelite people had lost their purpose. They'd forgotten that their purpose was to be in relationship with God. But you know the thing I love about God? Verses 7 to 8, when they cried out because of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet. I love that. God didn't go anywhere. God was just there waiting for them to turn back to him. And as soon as they turned back, he responded. And he responded by sending a prophet. The minute they turned to him, he started getting them out of the problem. And what did he do? Well, he called Gideon. He said, go with the strength you have and rescue the Midianites. He doesn't tell him how here. He just says, I'm sending you. I'm calling you. Go and do this thing. And Gideon's reaction was so much like ours. But who am I, God? Like, my family's nothing. I'm nothing. How can I do this? So God goes one step further. He doesn't just call him, he equips him. And he says, I'll be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. You know, the beautiful thing here, the Israelite people had turned away, but the minute they turned back, God answered, and he called Gideon. He gave him something to do to start fixing the situation, because God is a God of restoration. Now, that's a nice story, but what if you're in a situation that, well, you didn't turn away from God, just something's happened, someone else has made a decision that's impacted you, or some circumstance has happened that's put you in this mess? There's heaps of stories like this in the Bible. There's a story in Genesis, it's quite a long one, about Genesis 30 to 50, about a guy called Joseph. And Joseph had 11 brothers, and the father kind of favoured him. Long story, but his brothers hated him, and they sold him into slavery, and they told his dad that they were dead, that he was dead. Nice. You know, if you think your siblings are bad, at least they haven't sold you into slavery and told your parent you're dead. Charming guys. And so what ended up happening to Joseph is some things went good for him, some went bad. He ended up in prison, but he kept his relationship with God the whole time. He relied on God, and in the end, he ended up as the administrator over the whole of Egypt. And when a massive famine came, he actually, because of his relationship with God, he actually was able to save the people from the famine. And what happened one day, of course, his brothers rock up because they need food. They rock up to see him, and when they see him, they are terrified because they think, we sold our brother into slavery. And not just that, like he is now this leader. He is going to kill us. And so they beg him and they say, please, please don't kill us. Please forgive us. This is probably one of my favourite Bible verses here. Joseph said to them, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, the word intended there, I don't believe that God's like, sweet, off you go, get sold into slavery, rah, rah, rah. But his intended outcome was good. And I love the fact that no matter what happens in our lives, God can use it for good. Joseph hadn't done anything wrong. His brothers did. But as a result of that, he ended up in a really messy situation. But he knew that God was bigger than that situation, and he knew that God could turn it around. One of my other favourite Bible verses is this one from Romans. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And it addresses so many of the words we've talked about today. When we're fulfilling our purpose, when we're concentrating on Jesus, God calls us. When that happens and we're in God's calling and we're fulfilling our purpose, God's going to work things together for good. It doesn't mean bad things won't happen. Because we're human. We live in a fallen world. Bad things unfortunately do happen. But God can work it to good. He can work it to bring glory to him and to bring blessing to us and other people. And even sometimes when that doesn't make any sense at all, it can happen. So that's what I believe our purpose, our calling and our plan are. And I know there's people that are in a position where they're like, what is next for me, God? What do you want me to do with my life? Or there's people who are like, well, I'm at the other end, God. What do you want me to do in my retirement? What I want to say to you, wherever you're at today is, if you are focused on Jesus, you'll always have a purpose, but you'll also have a calling that he will call you to do things. While you're still breathing, is everyone breathing? You have a purpose and God has a calling for you. So I'm going to put up that list of questions again. I probably haven't answered them like you thought. I haven't said, Shy, this is what you're going to study next year. And I haven't said, what someone else's calling is or a specific thing God wants them to do. But if you're concentrating on Jesus, if you're focused on him, he will call you and he will guide you.